Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to get started with our last and final of 12 fall faculty book talks for fall 2016. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Harvard Law School Library. My name is June Casey. I'm the organizer of these talks, and today we are very privileged to have Professor Norm Champ here to celebrate his book, which has yet to be published. I think it's March 2017 is the publication date. And the book's title is Going Public, My Adventures Inside the SEC and How to Prevent the Next Devastating Crisis, a very relevant topic for today. Professor Champ is currently with us this semester at Harvard Law School as lecturer in law. And who else could write this book, but he is the former director of the Division of Investment Management at the SEC, and currently he is also partner in the private funds group at Kirkland Ellis. This talk is being co-sponsored by the Harvard Tax Law and Financial Regulation Students Association, and Dan will have a few comments to encourage you to join their group. After I finish with my remarks, I have just two more things to say. I'd like to let you know that we'll be having questions at the end of Professor Champ's talk. Please wait for the microphone to come to you. One of us will bring it to your table so that you can ask the question. And also just to let you know that the talk will be distributed through the law school's YouTube channel about a week or so after the talk, and any comments or questions that you make will be recorded and will be distributed on that video recording. So without any more, I will turn the mic over to Dan, and then to Professor Champ.
Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Dan Safransky, member of the Tax Law and Financial Regulation Students Association. We help co-sponsor this event, and we co-sponsor a number of events throughout this semester. We're going to be planning some for next semester as well. I would just encourage you that if you have an interest in either of those topics, tax law or financial regulation, make sure you're on our email list. If you're not on it, contact me. D. Safransky, that's D, S as in Sam, U, F like in Frank, RANSKI at jd18.law.harvard.edu. And I'll make sure you're on the list. You can stay up to date on any announcements. And if you have any ideas for other events or anything you'd like to sort of make happen as a group, we'd love to have you. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Great. Thanks so much, June. Thanks, Dan, for both to the Harvard Law School Library and to the Tax and Financial Regulation Students Association for co-sponsoring today's event. Got to tell you, today's my first book talk on the book, so I want feedback. Tell me how it goes. I thought I would talk maybe 25 minutes, half hour, something like that, and then we'll try to do questions around 35, 40 after. And I understand students need to make it to their next class, so we'll break no later than 10 of, maybe a little before that. First off, Norm Champ. I am teaching investment management law here this semester. I see a few of my students in the class, hello, and some students from last year. So great to see everybody, and great to everyone else for coming and joining. Thank you. I thought I would talk about the book really in three ways, right? So first off, how does someone who's a partner in a hedge fund firm, managing big hedge funds and doing all the things that involved, how does that person decide to leave a hedge fund and go and become a senior person at the SEC? So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that journey of going to the SEC and how that came about. Secondly, some of the issues we found at the SEC, so getting there post Bernie Madoff, post Alan Stanford, what was it like at the SEC, and what were some of the things that were going on in a government agency like that that contributed to Madoff, Stanford, and some of the other failures of the SEC. And then third, talk about some of the efforts that we undertook to kind of drag the agency into the 21st century and make some changes and think about ways that the agency could do better to fulfill its mission, which, if you are not familiar with the US Securities and Exchange Commission, has a three-part mission set by statute, right? Protect investors, facilitate capital formation, and ensure that the United States has fair and orderly markets. And so a lot of what we were doing when we were at the commission was to try to figure out how to make it more capable to do those things and make it more capable to fulfill its mission. And if you think about US capital markets, right, So as we're in this zone right now of discussion about the U.S. economy and jobs here and the different pieces of the U.S. economy, U.S. financial markets remain one of the shining pieces of the U.S. economy, right? We still have the deepest and best and most transparent markets in the world, and there's a reason that companies from all around the world come here and list their securities on our markets, right? And so if you think about the SEC's role in those markets and making sure that companies continue to do that, it's a critical piece of the U.S. economy to make sure that those markets are still the leaders around the world. And obviously the crisis called that leadership into question, and a lot of what we were doing was trying to think about how the SEC could do better in its mission. So definitely we'll turn it over to questions at the end, although happy to take questions along the way. So let me start with, hopefully the clicker works here. So the advertising page, of course, because that's why we're here, is to advertise the book. Book's called Going Public. That's Hamilton there. They originally had Benjamin Franklin. I was like, I'm not really sure Benjamin Franklin's going to do it. And then, of course, Hamilton being the big hit musical, right? We thought, well, let's try to capitalize on that. Also, you can't really tell here, but this is green. Originally, it was sort of a bluish gray, and Barnes & Noble was like, bluish gray? That doesn't, we need like green, like money, stand out, right? So we went with green. The book is available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other retailers' sites. And it is actually dropping in print in the end of February 22nd, I think. So we had scheduled this book talk, and so, because I'm going to be here teaching tomorrow, so we're a little early for when you would ordinarily do a book talk, but why not? So as June said, I'm currently a partner at Kirkland Ellis in the investment funds group, and that involves counseling investment funds, so mutual funds, hedge funds, private equity funds in complying with the U.S. regulatory system and actually worldwide. So we have regulatory lawyers abroad. We have 25 people devoted to investment funds regulatory practice, so and kind of all around the world. So in the last piece of time, we've been tremendously busy. I am teaching investment management law this fall, and I taught it last fall, and I've been teaching it since 2008. I was saying to some of my friends here that I used to teach it in January term, and now I teach it in the fall. After all my training and all my experience, I figured out that it's a lot warmer in Cambridge in the fall than it is in January. And so I wised up, and now I teach it in the fall when it's much nicer here on campus. So, and I'm going to teach it next fall as well. So as I said, how does someone from the hedge fund business end up going into the United States government? So I spent 5 years at the SEC from 2010 to 2015. The first half of that time as the deputy director of the exam program. So that is examining registrants with the SEC, so investment advisors, broker-dealers, national financial markets, examining them all across the country. And I'll sort of tell the story of how it came about, but about 2.5 years in, I became the director of the SEC's Division of Investment Management, which sets policy and guidance for the investment management industry in the United States. And that was 2010 to 2012, 2015. Before that, I had been a partner in an investment management firm, a hedge fund firm, as I mentioned. Was in private practice at Davis Polk, clerked in the Southern District of New York, and of course, graduated from here. I'm going to leave out what year I graduated from here because it's too long ago. So, you know, thinking about the SEC and going to the SEC, in 2008, right, the SEC suffered perhaps the greatest humiliation of a federal agency in, I don't know if it's all of US history, but for a long time, right? So we have the financial crisis in the fall of 2008, and I don't think the SEC's problems at that time really, the financial crisis itself was about a lot of different things, not so much about the SEC, but in the wake of the crisis, right, in December of 2008, and then in February of 2009, it was discovered that Bernie Madoff in New York and Alan Stanford in Texas were running massive Ponzi schemes that had defrauded investors of tens of billions of dollars each. And as investigations were done and things came to light, it turned out that the SEC had examined the operations of both Bernie Madoff and Alan Stanford multiple times over the years before the frauds were discovered after the crisis. And they had, in the case of Alan Stanford in Texas, they had examined him when he was around $200 million that he had in his scheme. And an examiner had written a report saying, this guy is running a Ponzi scheme, right? And that was 10 years before he was arrested and sent to jail for 200 years or whatever it was. And they had examined him multiple times after that. And despite the fact that examiners believed he was running a Ponzi scheme, the SEC was not able to do anything about that. It was not able to bring an enforcement action. And so in particular, that failure really hurt the commission and the perception of the commission, because they actually figured out that he was running a Ponzi scheme, but they didn't do anything about it when he was at $200 million, and eventually he stole more than $20 billion of investor money. So terrible failures, very difficult time for the SEC in the fall of '08. I was in the hedge fund business. I had dealt with the SEC over really my whole career, right, as an M&A lawyer and doing other things. I had worked with the SEC staff, worked on registration statements, and interacted with the SEC a lot. It was very difficult, as someone who had been in the securities area, it was very tough to watch the SEC basically, being held in public opprobrium and being subjected to hearings and all the things that were going on. Very tough to watch that and see an agency that I had respected a great deal be subject to the kind of criticism that it was under. And so in the spring of 2009, I started to think perhaps maybe I could offer some of my experience to the SEC, and maybe that would be helpful to them. For instance, at least kind of at the time that I was motivated about, was thinking, if I went into someone who said they were an investment fund, like Bernie Madoff, and he told me he was running an investment fund, having been a partner in an investment fund for 10 years, I would have figured out the guy was a fraud in about 10 minutes, right? I mean, I knew how funds worked, and I would have been able to see it. But he had never been examined by anyone from the investment management side. He was examined by people from the broker-dealer side who didn't totally understand that. So in 2009, started thinking about going to the government, and maybe for the students, just kind of thinking about how things work in careers. I had lunch with a friend of mine who was at the SEC in the spring of '09, and I said, Tom, I'm thinking about maybe going to the SEC, seeing all this stuff in the papers. I'm very concerned, and maybe I could help. And he said, well, that's convenient because I'm going to leave the SEC, so you can take my job. And in fact, 9 months later, that's exactly what happened. Although to apply for a job at the SEC, you have to get online and fill out all sorts of forms, and it's a whole process. But ultimately, that is exactly what happened. He left, and I went in to be in the exam program at the SEC. Mary Shapiro was the chair of the SEC at the time, and for the SEC to hire someone who had worked at a hedge fund, you would have thought that the world was going to stop spinning on its axis, right? Hedge funds were this new thing and invested in markets and got lots of headlines, and there really hadn't been anyone who had worked at a hedge fund who then came and worked at the SEC. So it had to go pretty much all the way up to Mary Shapiro, who was like, yes, I want to get more expertise in the agency, and I'd love for you to come. She did ask me to stay for 3 years, which I agreed to do. And so I started the SEC in January of 2010. And I talk about in the book, it was, I think one of the things that I really try to bring out of the book is that this is a very personal thing, right? And James, a friend of mine in the audience, James Shipton, who was at the Hong Kong Regular, knows this. You are leaving the industry and you're leaving a place where you're a partner, in my case, in a hedge fund, and you have security, and you have basically a career, and you are putting that behind you, and you are going to the U.S. government. The U.S. government obviously doesn't pay as well as the hedge fund industry, so you're also explaining to your family those kind of things. And it's a very personal thing to do, and I felt very motivated to try to help the SEC and help the U.S. after the crisis. You just saw the chaos that the crisis was creating in the United States at that time. I mean, January of 10, we were still in the midst of it. I mean, no one knew exactly what was going to happen. It turned out that the stock market had reached its low in March of 2009, but in January of 2010, nobody knew that. And so it was a very fragile time, a very personal decision to go. I remember taking the oath of office for the job, and it's a very solemn thing where you get sworn in, and the whole you take an oath. And I remember getting extremely emotional, starting to tear up, and then sitting down with my co-leaders in New York and thinking, all right, let's not cry on our first day, right? And so I managed to hold back on that. But it was tremendously rewarding to be able to go to the SEC and to be able to go into government and try to bring the experience from the fund world into the commission. And so I would do it again in a heartbeat. What I'll mention is that, moving from exam to investment management after 2.5 years was not in the plan. I had told Mary I would stay for 3 years, and I was very ready to head out after 3 years. But when she asked me to head up investment management, there's kind of one time in your career where you might get a chance to do that job. So I took it and stayed another 2.5 years for a total of 5. So just a couple quick things on the SEC itself. Very relevant now that the appointments are being made and the government's being formed. I mentioned the mission. The SEC has about 4,000 people and 12 offices around the country. Only 5 commissioners who are appointed by the president. So that's important because if you think about the United States Treasury, the Trump administration will be naming around 350 top officials to the Treasury. Those are all presidential appointees. At the SEC, we're talking about 5 presidential appointees. And what that means is that a new administration can make dramatic changes in some place like Treasury, right? The top 340 people are going to be on board with moving what's going to happen in new policy directions. At the SEC, you've got the 5 people at the top. Everybody else is there, essentially are career employees. And that makes the SEC a much bigger ship to turn, if you will. Each of these appointees is allowed to bring a couple of extra political appointees with them, but they're not presidential appointees. But you only have 5 presidential appointees, 3 from, in this case, as we're coming up, it'll be 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The time I joined the SEC, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So it is a different place than a lot of the executive departments. It's an independent agency. It's enforcing 4 statutes. Something that I think sometimes gets lost is that as we have Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, all these different updates to the securities laws, those are all amending 4 statutes. So the SEC continues to administer those 4 statutes, which are all around 80 years old, and they are showing their age. So quickly, just on the major divisions, there are 6 major divisions at the SEC. So I was deputy director in the exam division and then moved over to be director of investment management. These 6 divisions at the SEC control, 3,400 maybe of the 4,000 people, 3,500. The rest of the folks work in other smaller offices. Corporation finance governs the public companies in the United States. So that's the 1933 Act. Companies, Google, Apple, whatever, whoever's publicly traded. Trading and markets supervises broker-dealers and the national securities markets. Economic and risk analysis analyzes all the rules that the SEC passes to see if they make economic sense. Investment management, as I mentioned, is the fund industry in the United States. Investment management industry, which is now up to something like $80 trillion, a massive, primarily because of retirement in the United States being turned over to private accounts, 401ks and IRAs. Investment management has become huge and very important. Examination that goes out and examines these folks, other than the public companies. And then enforcement, which brings civil enforcement actions against people who violate the federal securities laws. SEC does not have criminal jurisdiction, something you'll often hear, why isn't so-and-so being charged, or why aren't people going to jail, that kind of stuff. The SEC does not bring criminal cases. If you look at cases like criminal insider trading, those things, those are done by the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice, often in collaboration with the SEC. So when we arrive at the SEC in 2010, you find a kind of a different world than most of us in the private sector are used to, and a world that is a bit resistant to change of doing things differently. So the one that I still cannot get over is that there were not written manuals about how to do things. So there weren't manuals about how to do exams. There weren't manuals for how investment management functioned. And so one of the great things we were able to accomplish was getting written manuals in place. It is a no sticks, no carrot environment. So as a manager, right, there's no real monetary rewards, so on the upside. and also no one can really be fired on the downside. So as a manager, you are in an environment with no carrots, no sticks, and you have to think about what motivates people and how can we get people motivated in an environment that doesn't have the usual private sector motivation. So people go there because they're interested in public service, they're interested in securities laws, but you have to think about how to motivate them. Some people want a lot of recognition, so they want to be in press releases when things go well. Other people don't want to have anything to do with being publicized, just want to quietly do their work. So it's an interesting set of dynamics that managers have to deal with. It is a union shop, which is often surprising to folks. A lot of the federal financial regulators are not union shops, but the SEC is, National Treasury Employees Union. I worked very closely with the leadership of NTEU. They were, while protective obviously of their workers, on the flip side, they also were very concerned about the crisis and the things that have been exposed. And so we were able to find a lot of common ground as far as trying to increase training for folks at the commission and doing a bunch of reorganizations that we undertook to try to make the commission work better. The system, some of those things aren't so great for change and for making things as productive as they can be, but you have a lot of quiet patriots at the SEC who are there to fulfill the mission. They're devoted to the mission. Many of them spend inordinate number of hours doing those things and trying to make sure that investors are protected despite some of the issues with the system. So some of the things that we really tried to change at the SEC were around the two divisions I was in. I mentioned the manual, so in examinations, trying to get a manual, and we got it, pulling together all of the groups within the examination division, one manual, how do we do things, who does what, who reports to whom, how do we carry out exams. We got that issued and got that out there, and folks are still following that. And that's so critical in an organization because otherwise everything else is passed down by oral history, right? So I got there and I'm like, well, someone asked me, well, how do you want to do this exam? And I said, well, I just walked in off the street from a hedge fund. I mean, I might have an idea on how to do that exam, but we don't have anything that shows how to do that. Well, there's some emails, there's this. So we really were able to pull everything together into one place, which is critical to communicate to new employees, but also so that existing employees can make sure, hey, I can look it up. Okay, this person reports to that person, or if this happens, I should refer it here. And in particular, that had to do with trying to make sure that something like Stanford didn't happen again, right? So Stanford, the examiners knew he was a Ponzi scheme. They couldn't get people in enforcement at the local level to work on that case. So of course, in the manual, we put in escalation procedures so that could be taken all the way to the top of the SEC, if need be, to make sure that action would be taken. So got manuals in place. We hired a lot more experts, many of whom are still there, trying to increase the number of people who understood the markets and could get out and really examine firms. And automated exam reports. It's hard to admit this, but the exam reports at the time were in paper form. They were put in files in local offices. That didn't really help the national effort, right? So we automated the exam reports so everyone could see them and people could take advantage of them. In the Division of Investment Management, when we moved over there, some similar things, getting a manual in place, but most importantly, making the division much closer to the data that we have out there on the markets. So Division of Investment Management was a lot of lawyers, great lawyers. They know investment management super well. But they weren't that in touch with the data that the commission had and how you would use that data to identify problems out in the industry, figure out where to do rulemaking. And so we got a risk and examination office formed, and we were able to figure out how to take data and make sure we understood where the risks were in the market. And that use of data, I think if I maybe went across the entire period of trying to make the SEC better, I think the single biggest improvement has been it is much better at using the data it receives. It receives massive amounts of data, and it's got to process that and look at it. It's still not all the way there, but it's a lot better so that there is much better ability to look for risk and look for problem firms and look for things that maybe the SEC should go out and look at. And so I would think that might be the single biggest improvement at the SEC. So a couple other things to mention before we open it up for questions. The other thing that was going on while I was at the SEC was that the Dodd-Frank Act had created something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council. So that was a group of all of the federal regulators that was supposed to go out and figure out whether there was systemic risk in the system in the United States. It was a response to the crisis. It was actually a response to the crisis that was based on the response to 9/11. So if you go back to 9/11, right, the 9/11 Commission report showed that a lot of intelligence agencies had different pieces of the 9/11 story, right? Some people knew that people were training to fly planes, but not training how to land, right? Other people knew that certain folks had come into the United States. There were pieces throughout the US intelligence system, but no one had been able to put it all together. The solution after 9/11 was to create the Director of National Intelligence position, right? Where all the intelligence agencies would come together, and then there would be a staff above it to sort of coordinate what they were doing and try to make sure that things like that weren't missed again. The solution, Dodd-Frank could have taken, I think, a number of different paths on this, right? You could have merged some of the regulators. You could have figured out other things. I think I personally would have favored that, merging the SEC and the CFTC, Fed and OCC, putting some of these agencies together so you have fewer places that are looking at things and hopefully coordinating better. Congress chose more of the Director of National Intelligence model. So they put a council above all of the US financial regulators, Financial Stability Oversight Council, and said, look, you go figure out who are the systemically risky firms or the systemically risk activities in the United States. And so that led to the FSOC, as it's referred to, going out and looking and seeing where might there be risk and where might it extend federal regulation. So kind of, I don't know, serendipitously or I don't know, conveniently, somehow, the Financial Stability Oversight Council got focused on asset management and the investment management industry, which is what I was in charge of. And so really, for the time that I was in charge of investment management, most of the time was spent trying to deal with the Financial Stability Oversight Council and try to address their concerns, their worries about asset management and their desire to get involved and designate certain asset managers as systemically significant. So it turned out to be extremely fortunate that we had formed the Risk and Exam Office within investment management because FSOC came out, wanted to designate firms. And we were able to talk to them about those firms, talk to them about the asset management industry in general, and ultimately persuade them that picking 2 asset managers to designate out of 12,000 asset managers in the United States, I used to say to the guys at the FDIC, I'm like, look, if you pick the right 2, you are a genius beyond genius, right? We got 12,000 firms. You know, how are you going to predict who the problem firms are going to be? It's extremely difficult to think that you would be able to pick the right 2 out of 12,000. And so ultimately, we were able to convince the Financial Stability Oversight Council that that probably wasn't a great idea. And they instead started looking at how activities by asset managers might impact the broader system. So securities lending, other things that asset managers are doing, perhaps those are things we should look at as opposed to trying to grab on to a couple of firms. So it turned out to be great timing. A couple of the other things that were going on, we had the credit rating agencies in the United States, which had come under the SEC's jurisdiction because of Dodd-Frank. Credit rating agencies during the crisis had run into a lot of criticism themselves because they had rated mortgage bonds and things AAA. Turned out they weren't AAA. So we examined the credit rating agencies, and then ultimately Standard & Poor's decided to downgrade the United States, which you might have read about. There's the litigation that still goes on about that. And so we had a lot of interaction with S&P around that, some of which was kind of beyond hilarious. One day we went over to talk to S&P after the downgrade, and I was like, look, we just want to come over and chat with you and figure out what's going on. And so we go in the room, and they're like, well, we're a little concerned about you coming over. Meet Floyd Abrams, our First Amendment lawyer, probably the most famous First Amendment lawyer in the United States. I'm like, guys, calm down. We just want to chat. We're not. I don't think you need Floyd Abrams here. So we talked to him about the downgrade. I always felt good that ultimately they and the Treasury got into a lawsuit about who had done what around the downgrade and stuff, but they never came after the SEC. So I guess we didn't do anything that crossed the First Amendment line. We also had the Volcker Rule, the money market fund reform. Volcker Rule obviously now coming in for a lot of attention from the government and from the incoming administration. Volcker Rule was an attempt to draw a line within large financial institutions between banking deposits that are insured by the federal government and risk-taking activities that are not insured by the federal government. It's 1,000 pages trying to draw that line between those activities. It's incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult for banks to comply with. We'll have to see. There have been a number of articles about where that might go. And then we also have to reform money market mutual funds because they had had difficulties during the crisis in breaking the buck. Money market mutual funds were allowed to be at $1 a share, unlike all other mutual funds that move with the assets underlying them. And so we ended up changing how they worked, most of how they worked, so that there were floating net asset values for most of those funds. So what are the things that I feel like we accomplished while we were there? I think that rulemaking at the SEC has become much more evidence-based. One of the things that you find in rulemaking, and this is true across the entire country, is that people think something sounds good, and so they pass a law about it without actually having really worked out what the impact of that might be. Just as an example, in Dodd-Frank, Congress said that if you were a public company and you obtained minerals from a conflict jurisdiction, you had to put that into your disclosure, right? There is only one conflict jurisdiction, which is Congo, unfortunately undergoing a civil war. Public companies decided not going to buy any more minerals from the Congo, right? And so the few existing mines and so forth that were in the Congo all went out of business, and it was devastating for Congo's economy and did nothing to help the civil war. And so one of the things I feel like the commission got a lot better about was thinking about what are the real impacts of statutes, of rules, how will these things work out in real practice? And the Economic and Risk Analysis Group did that, I think, much better, and the commission committed to a much more rigorous analysis of the consequences of its rulemaking. I talked about adding experts to Risk and Exam Office and also getting FSOC to back off on asset managers. Just a couple things. I did get to spend the last chapter of the book talking about what I think should happen next. It turns out that no one wants to read 10 chapters about what I think should happen next, but I did get the last chapter to do that. As you can tell, I'm a fan of evidence-based rulemaking. There are a number of efforts across the country to try to think about how evidence-based rulemaking could be used to make sure that we make good policy choices. Another simple example, you see a lot of jurisdictions saying no more plastic bags when you go shopping, right? Well, it turns out a lot of people use those plastic bags as garbage bags when they get home, right? Evidence-based rulemaking would suggest, like, let's look and see if we ban plastic bags, well, then people go home and just buy more garbage bags, right? I mean, and I don't know the answer to that, but let's at least investigate that. So I think that's something that we've got to commit to across the whole country because the consequences of a lot of the rules usually are unintended. And then second and third, my personal absolute pet peeve that I promise you we will have another financial crisis in this world. We have been having financial crisis and bubbles in this world for millennia, right? We go back to the Dutch tulip boom, where tulips in Holland became the most valuable thing there was. We can go back another 1,000 years to that, to Roman times and grain harvests and booms and busts and grain prices rising and people starving. I mean, we are going to have other financial crises. And I think it's unrealistic to expect the government, whether it's the Financial Stability Oversight Council or the SEC, to prevent those crises. That's just not what they do, right? The government is not really equipped to do that. Individuals are. So a lot of the things that I would like to see us do are try to promote individual responsibility for investments. We've already done that by turning over most retirement plans in the United States to individuals, but we've done so without educating them at all about how to manage those retirement accounts. So you're going to go, the students here, you're going to go to your law firms or wherever you end up, companies or public interest, there's going to be 401ks or 403b, I think is the nonprofit one, or you're going to get an IRA. You're going to have tax-free retirement accounts. That's going to be your retirement arrangement in the private sector in the United States. Along with those accounts is not going to come a financial literacy course about how to run those accounts and how to invest them. And so I'd like to see us do a lot better to educate people about those accounts. My particular pet peeve on that is, so people will say to me, well, we can't do financial education, it's never going to happen, this, that, and the other thing. I'm like, well, on the other hand, the government spends billions of dollars and tons of effort successfully to promote the worst investment in human history, which is the lottery, right? So you can't go 2 feet outside the law school and not see an ad for a lottery ticket, right? Your odds of winning the lottery are right up there with your odds of being struck by lightning. And so we are able to promote lottery, promote a terrible investment, and some of the things I talk about in the book. Among low-income households, there are people who spend up to 10% of their income on lottery ticket playing. And so I'd like to see us try to prepare individuals much better for financially to withstand the next crisis. So I will stop there. It's 20 of. I think the students have to leave around 10 of, so open it up for any questions that people might have. Some questions in the back.
Thanks for coming and giving the book talk. I was wondering, how would you encourage or incentivize other people such as yourself who have ideas and want to affect change on institutions such as the SEC and make it more efficient to, make that leap and go work for those organizations?
So that's a great question. Thanks. I think that just to repeat for the camera, how would you get other folks to go into public service? I mean, I think that it's a very personal decision, as I mentioned at the outset, and I would also say one not to take lightly. So I say in the book, I think I was a little naive going into the government and thinking, oh, I have this expertise, 20 years in the industry, people would love to draw on my expertise to help out. Not so much, right? I mean, it's an institution, it can be resistant to change, and there's some, there can be a lot of resistance to that, so it's something you have to think about carefully. I think for encouraging folks, I hope people will read the book and be encouraged in the sense that despite the obstacles, despite some of the difficulties, I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. It is the most rewarding, I'm sure going to be the most rewarding and best part of my career, hands down, because in my case, to actually be one of the top regulators of investment management, which is something I devoted my career to, I often be walking down a hall and I would say to myself, did you really come here and get to do this? I mean, it's unreal, right? You're on the inside making policy and you're having an influence on how US financial services policy comes out. It's amazing. So it's great fun and very rewarding, but it has its difficulties. I think I hope people will read the book and want to do more of it. I'm not sure formally how we get people to do more of it. I'd like to see maybe the hiring process at the government be a little easier. There's so many rules and bureaucracy and all this stuff. It's very hard to get people in from the outside. I mean, I probably was 9 months from starting the application to getting in, so it moves very slowly. I think if it moved a little faster and was a little easier, that might help. Disclosure, also, one other thing I would say is disclosure side of it is really tough, right? So to have to disclose every investment you own, everything that you have, and have that available for public inspection, not for the faint of heart either. Sure.
Hi, I was amazed to hear that an examiner for the SEC found 10 years before everyone else that a Ponzi scheme was going on and that nothing could be done about it. Could you provide us with some more detail about how it was that there was no prosecution there? I can't imagine that laws weren't broken that were applicable.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
question, how was Alan Stanford, why did the examiners write a report saying it was a Ponzi scheme but nothing happened for 8-10 years? It's, from the structure diagram, right, you have folks enforcing these laws, and you have those groups I showed across there. And unfortunately, it's a bit siloed, like many organizations, and so it's hard to get coordination across them. One of the big things we were trying to do with the manuals and other things to try to get people to work together, we shrunk a number of groups so that, combined a lot of groups so people would work more together. But unlike 99.9999% of America, I had to read the Inspector General reports about Madoff and Stanford, so Madoff's was 800 pages. So basically in Stanford, they had it in the exam report, but the enforcement folks in that office were worried about trying to prove Stanford, was selling supposedly CDs in Antigua, and so there were offshore issues of how you're going to go investigate that. There was a lot of kind of little bit of inertia around trying to get out and investigate that and perceive difficulties that it might be to investigate that. What I'm hopeful of is that the manuals we put in place contain escalation procedures, because I would say the thing that amazed me was not so much it was found, but that, I mean, if I went to someone and said, hey, I've got this Ponzi scheme, go do something, and they didn't do anything, I'm going up the chain, right? I'm not just, oh, okay, I'll put this back in the file? Like, you know, it's hard to imagine, right? So we put in a lot of formal escalation procedures, including all the way to the top, right? So that, like, if you're someone, you have that, and you go and it doesn't get moved, you can go up the chain. It's just kind of that part, the lack of escalation amazed me, so we really tried to address that. But it's a tragedy. I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is the examiner who found it ultimately testified in Congress in 2011, which was a wild scene, and I went with her. And you know, we had Madoff victims in the front row holding signs and everything, you know, people who had lost their life. I mean, you can see on the American Greed or these shows or whatever, I mean, these people have lost their life savings, right? I mean, it's serious stuff.
Perhaps I can ask you a little direct question. Before Enron disaster, startups were able to go public without spending literally $1 million worth in accounting. Is there any way to still do it?
So question, you know, before Enron and then Sarbanes-Oxley that came after that, you know, it was much easier to access U.S. capital markets. So look, if you go on any, you know, AQR happens to have a great website on IPOs. You go on any website that has the data, you will see that the number of IPOs, the number of public companies in the United States is doing this, right? That has to do with a lot of things, the costs of going public. It has to do with a lot of the political disclosure that was in Dodd-Frank, like I mentioned, the conflict minerals, extractive resources you have to disclose if you pay for, you know, taking oil out of the ground. I mean, there's all these things that have been added to being a public company. Pay ratio, you know, a political one in Dodd-Frank was what's the ratio of the top executives pay to the front, you know, the median person or whatever. I just saw in the state of Washington, now they're talking about, well, if your pay ratio is too high, you know, the exec makes too much, we're going to have an extra tax in the state of Washington for that, right? So the parade of how hard it is to be a public company continues. I would say the one thing on the other side of the ledger is the Jobs Act of 2012 does have some procedures around sort of what we would call crowdfunding and those kinds of things to make it a little bit easier for startups to raise money. One piece of that was saying that private companies could go up to 2,000 investors without having to register under the 34 Act. That was an improvement. There had been 500. So you see Uber and some of these folks staying private much longer because they can have many more investors. So I would say there are a couple provisions allowing people to go public a little more easily, but it is a very expensive proposition, and it's being shown in the stats. We have fewer public companies. So I would be hopeful that the new administration would try to ease up on some of that stuff so that we could get more access to U.S. capital markets.
Other questions?
Hi. Back to the title of your book, the last part, How to Prevent the Next Devastating Crisis.
Yep. So I sort of worked in several of those along the way. I mean, look, the biggest single thing is we've got to prevent the impacts of the crisis. So we've got to do better with teaching folks how to deal with their finance. That is ultimately the only protection. The government is just, I've been inside there. The government is not going to protect us, right? There was just a quote the other day, somebody said, you know, I'm not aware of any time the government predicted a crisis and actually did something about it. I mean, it just doesn't, that's not how government works. So I believe that it's up to, I would like to see much more financial literacy education so that we can prepare people for, you know, withstanding it. On the positive things that I think we should do, we got to merge some of these agencies together. We have got to have less. There's 10. I would like to see us merge several of them together so we have fewer agencies. I also think the evidence-based policymaking is critical because remember, before the 2008 crisis, the US government wanted people who couldn't afford houses to borrow and buy them, right? And I say in the book, I just feel for those people who borrowed money in that circumstance and then got foreclosed on. I'm sure they're not feeling so great about home ownership, right? So that was a case where it sounded good to have people who couldn't afford houses borrow money and buy them. Well, it turned out not to be so good. So I think government has a responsibility to really try to understand what it's doing, because every time it messes, you know, every time the government goes into a market or meddles in something, there's always an unintended consequence, like millions of people getting their houses foreclosed on. So I'd like to see government pull back and only do what's absolutely necessary and not do some of these things that sound great but don't work out so well.
So on the financial literacy point, it seems like every other day there's an article saying that you should just put your money in a passive fund like Fidelity or Vanguard and just not worry about it. And it seems like there's kind of a lot of defensiveness from the actively managed funds. Do you think the government should be encouraging people to put their money in passive funds? And if not, kind of what is the financial literacy education that you see look like?
That's a tremendous question. I could go on forever for that, but I want to make sure we let the students get back to class. But so look, just like I don't think the government should have been encouraging people to buy houses from 2000 to 2008, I don't think the government should be encouraging people to go into passive investments, right? People should go into a mix of investments that enable them to withstand the next, bubble. And where are we in a bubble right now? I mean, stocks are looking very, I'm a lawyer, not a stock picker, but stocks look very highly valued. So I would like to see us not encouraging that. I think the encouragement of passive investment, it's also linked to something else, which is I think there are a lot of folks in federal regulation who would like to see much more regulation of asset management, particularly retirement asset management, and even sort of state plans. California started a state plan where people who don't have a 401k can put money. The crazy thing about that is what does it invest in? California state debt, right? So I don't think the government should be trying to get you to invest in passive or in California state debt or anything else. You should be investing in a mix of securities. What would I do? I have seen some of these financial literacy efforts the last few years, and I actually took a picture of one and keep it on my phone. There was a poster put up by AICPA, the accountants, and the Ad Council, and it's on a lot of bus stops in Manhattan. It says, be the rich, eccentric uncle you wish you had. I mean, what does that mean, right? I assume that was meant to try to encourage people to save or something. It's like, no. So what we need is much more direct. And I would like to hit education. I mean, so I sort of have a target. I've got William Birdthistle, professor in Chicago. He and I are trying to think about, what's the right age. I mean, I sort of think 18 to 28, somewhere in that zone early, try to get people early. The stats show that high school financial literacy education doesn't stick very long, so I think maybe early in your career, and it should be much more direct. Don't buy a house you can't afford. Max out your 401k. All the law students here, max out your 401k. I'm telling you, like when you get to the firm and you're going like, oh my goodness, how am I going to pay rent? Max out your 401k. The government gives you very few tax-free advantages, right? That's not what the IRS is in the business of doing. That's one that exists. So so I would like to see very direct messages to people that are just the simple. I mean, we got people to sort of absorb 4 or 5 basics, right? I mean, I think it's like housing shouldn't be, I think maybe 20-25% of your budget. Max your 401k. That's a huge gift. The compounding effect of a tax-free account where you put a lot of money in your 20s. By the time you get to your 60s is incredible. And now you do have to have the right mix. And so I would like to see, again, diversification. We got to get a mix of investments, but much more direct investments. We're way too general with people. Like I think, and don't play the lottery. All right, it's about 8 minutes. Maybe one last question.
Time. One more question.
James.
Norm, great speech. You mentioned in the slides and also in response to the question about the Stanford and the Madoff scenarios, there's a lot of talk in the industry about there being a cultural problem in finance, in the financial industry. But in your experience, is there also a cultural problem inside the SEC? And how do you address that?
Right, so I have to say within the financial services industry, which I do a lot of work for, I find most people trying to do the right thing. I do not see a lot of cultural issues. Government, some of the stuff I alluded to, government does have cultural problems, right? It's hard to motivate people. You take away kind of the natural motivations, it's tough. There are some tremendously motivated people, though. I think it is hard, like a default in the government can be to do nothing, right? Just sort of keep your head down and, this too shall pass. That is, people often say that. So I would like to see a little more accountable organization. I'd like to see mergers within the SEC. It's still very siloed across these groups. I'd like to see some of that stuff put back together so that you have fewer places that people can be unaccountable. Because one thing that people do, oh, it's them, they're responsible, not me. I'd like to see less groups so that we could have more accountability and more responsibility. I think the people that go there are motivated and they want to help out. The system of how it works doesn't really help facilitate that, and I'd like to see the system reward that drive and that, that patriotism that gets people to go there. So, all right, we better leave it there. Let students go back to class. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.